Right. Good evening, everybody. It's an honor to be here speaking with you. Thank you for the opportunity for us to engage in a reflection together on such a beautiful parable of the sower among many of the parables that Christ spoke to us. There's so much deep meanings about it, so we will attempt to do justice in the limited time that we have. But I'd like to invite you to really engage in a reflection together rather than simply a lecture. What we're going to be discussing are some of the key terms that we find in the lecture, in the parable of the sower, including things like the kingdom of heaven, the idea that Christ says is not of this world. We're going to examine some of the points of the Sermon of the Mountain and gain an understanding of what they mean when they talk about death, not necessarily death of the physical body. We're going to see how it ties with the study. And then at the end, we're going to watch a very quick musical video performance of an orchestra that in the music itself, it summarizes a lot of what the parable of the sower is compelling us to do. So I hope that we can all leave here more comforted, more inspired. And if we have time, we can have Q&A or comments at the end. Yeah. So shall we get to it? All right. So before we actually jump into the parable, I want to invite you all for us to do a expansion of our horizons for a second and step out of where we currently are and grasp and contemplate together the vastness of our universe so that we can have that as the backdrop and then come back here. Yeah? So, do we know the answer to this question? What is the size of our known universe? By that we mean the physical universe? Unlimited? That's what scientists would say, right? They also have a few data points that they've been able to investigate thanks to science and technology. So we can do a little quick summary here just to get an idea. What do we see here? The Milky Way galaxy. This is our neighborhood. This is where we are. And to have an idea on size, to go from one end to another end, scientists estimate that would take 100,000 years if we travel at the speed of light, which is the fastest possible speed we in our three-dimensional physical reality are able to travel. And in it, they estimate that there are anywhere between 100 to 400 billion suns. Stars, just like our sun, some greater, some smaller, some younger, some older, but between 100 to 400 billion. That's a number even hard to comprehend, and that's just in our neighborhood alone, right? Let's zoom out a little bit more, and what do we see here? Other than the mouse arrow, which I'm going to put away. This is a very famous image of the Hubble Space Telescope. It's a series called the Deep Field Imaging, where the Hubble telescope is able to capture in one frame here tens of thousands of galaxies, just like the Milky Way we saw in the previous slide. In this frame alone, we see tens of thousands, some much larger than the Milky Way, some equal, some smaller, some younger, some older. But nonetheless, in one frame we see that. And based on all of the findings from the Hubble Space Telescope and other telescopes, scientists are able to estimate that in our observable universe, there are anywhere from 100 to 200 billion galaxies. So if there are that many billion galaxies, and each galaxy has about 100 to 400 billion suns, how many planets must be out there, right? And now here we are back in our physical bodies. To put that into perspective, right? This is where we are. So this starts to become a little too hard to grasp and we get a little cross-eyed. So then let's go closer to home. The street where we live, the solar system, right? We have a few neighbors here, 8 planets. Let's not go into the Pluto controversy. Is it a planet? Is it not a planet? But this is where we are. Our sun here, our planet Earth, and where we call home today, spirits, who according to Emmanuel, there are about 20 billion disincarnates that are hovering around the earth. Emmanuel wrote that in the book Roteiro, which is roadmap or script, in 1952. And at the time, there were 3 billion people on the earth. So if you take the incarnates with the discarnates, you get about 20 to 25 billion spirits. Jesus Christ being the Christ responsible for the governance, for the formation, for the development of this planet, right? So we understand from reading the books by Emmanuel that the man that we've come to know in the human manifestation as Jesus Christ is an individual just like us that was created simple and ignorant by God, just like us at some point, and was able to reach through his own efforts the status in the physical, in the spiritual evolution of a pure spirit to a stage called a Christ, where he is completely dematerialized and pure in the sense that God is able to entrust Jesus and other Christs like him with the formation, development, and governance of an entire planet. So there were 20 to 25 billion of us here on this planet, right? How many planets did we estimate that there are based on what we saw in the galaxies? It's a number that we can't even express, right? So if we were just to take these two things, we could conclude that eventually each individual here will be able to have a planet. So just like Oprah, you get a planet, you get a planet, and you get a planet, and you get a planet, and everybody gets a planet, right? Now, it's up to us through our efforts to actually get to that stage of evolution, but it is us tomorrow. That unfolding of the individuality of the man we know as Jesus in the human flesh to being this magnificent Christ that is able to supervise the moral, the intellectual, the physical, the biological, entire formation and continuous growth of this planet is an individual that can be just like us tomorrow. That's amazing, right? And departing from the same point inside of us. All of that potentiality that has been unfolded in the individuality of the Spirit of Jesus is the same that makes us inside. It's no different. So we zoomed out a lot. We went to the extreme macro, and now we're going to go to the other opposite, the micro, looking at the mustard seed, the smallest seed out there. It's only, as you can see in that person's thumb, about 1 millimeter. And in it, there is the blueprint for this. I made sure that I got a mustard tree on Google. I asked Google many times, is this a real mustard tree? Because I couldn't believe it. I had to say real mustard tree. Yes, it is a mustard tree. Can grow to as much as 10 feet tall. From this to this. Now think about that in our comparison with the universe reflection. If we today can be that mustard seed and we can unfold to the point of reaching that Christ that can embrace an entire planet. And that's what Christ was also hinting at in the parable of the mustard seed. Of course, he couldn't talk about galaxies and supernovas and things like that, but he used the information there, and the people that felt it understood. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and sowed in his field, and this is smaller than all other seeds. But when it is full grown, it is larger than the garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. Isn't that what we as spirits are doing on this planet? Being temporarily welcomed, embraced, and received by Jesus. Many of us spirits from other places, exiles, and when we read the books by Emmanuel, we understand that. It's like the birds come and nest in its branches, right? So we are going to use a lot of information from Emmanuel's incredible understanding of the passages of the gospel to elaborate on the parable of the sower. So on lesson 68, he confirms this when he elaborates on Paul's message. We are co-workers with God. You are God's field, God's building. So Jesus and other Christs of the solar system are all working together in an amazing community, co-creating with God. We are also doing that in our very own small, minute, limited way for now. But we're going to see how that expands and grows. So Emmanuel says something very beautiful here. The work of sowing and construction, which is what we're going to talk about, work entails sowing and building, which demands everybody's personal effort and goodwill. For according to the apostles' symbolism, a plant needs time and care to grow, and a solid house cannot be built in one day. Let's remember that, a solid house, this image, a solid house cannot be built in one day, because we're going to apply that when we start actually reviewing the lecture, the parable. So far, so good? Questions? Okay. So, let's discuss the actual act of sowing. This is an example of sowing, but who here farms on a daily basis? Wow, other than Adam. If you are like most people, it's very hard to come across the day-to-day contact with the earth. So sometimes these notions of farming that Christ used in his parable can get a little lost. And we think in sowing that it requires one part for you to plant the seeds, and you leave it alone, and then you come back for the reaping later, right? No. Okay.
It's a lot of work involved.
It's a lot of work involved, absolutely. And the sowing then happens, if there's a lot of work involved, every day. As Emmanuel says in lesson 160 of the Living Spring, every single day is a time of sowing, and every single day is a time of reaping. And now here's a very important concept that we sometimes get caught up in the wrong way. One does not have to cross the darkness of the grave in order to come face to face with justice. In accordance with the principles of cause and effect, we are incessantly confronted with its guidance at every moment of our life. Because we tend to think, if we bring our conditionings from sometimes past lives in organized religions that say, okay, you do this and then you get your reward later in heaven when you arrive there, or you get it in hell. We start to think that the sowing happens only here, but the reaping is only going to happen after we die. And that's not the case when we study Spiritism. We see that constantly occurring. And we realize that the death of the physical body is nothing more than a cessation of physical life. Because if we are as elevated, as purified, as dematerialized, and as conscious of our spiritual awareness as possible, then when we arrive in the spirit realm, there is no need for adaptation, for recovery, for a moment of incubation, for a lot of care for you to be able to cross to the other side, if you will. So much so, for example, we can get several stories, but one came to a spiritist center in Brazil of a fireman who's actually a minister for a living here in New York, but was a fireman in his off hours. And when 9/11 happened, he rushed downtown to help. And this was a very holy man, very hardworking, very Christ-like. And when the first tower began to crumble, because he arrived very early, he realized that the amount of rocks coming his way, he knew that that was going to be it for him. So he knelt down and he took down his helmet, and a rock hit him. The next moment he felt a warm hand of a radiant being saying, "Get up, my friend, let's go work." And he immediately got up and started helping all of the spirits that were arriving in the physical realm. Talk about a quick transition, right? So when we say immortal life, that we hear a lot in the different passages, we start to understand a little bit of where we're getting at, to the kingdom of heaven. So every day is a time of sowing, and every day is a time of reaping. And what's beautiful in Emmanuel's comments is the comfort that he's able to imprint Because he says we don't have to cross the grave in order to come face to face with justice. In accordance with the principles of cause and effect, we're incessantly confronted with its guidance. It's guidance. It's a loving Father that doesn't sit like a severe judge, pointing and condemning, but a loving Father that is merely guiding us through the laws of cause and effect. So that ought to leave us very comforted when we read that at every moment of our life. So we start to get other concepts in farming like grafting, which is a very new concept for me. I had no idea what it entailed. I had to do research. Does anybody know what grafting is? Adam is nodding his head vigorously. Explain to us, Adam, please, what is grafting, if you can.
Basically, you cut a piece of one tree and you make a space for that piece and you put it onto another tree and create a better variety of apples or peaches.
So you grab different species and combine it into one for it to grow together.
Well, not different species. They can be the same apples or oranges, just different trees, different
varieties.
And you just cross them. And that
Right.
creates
A new tree. So it's connecting the tissue of one plant with the tissue of another plant, one plant that doesn't have the sap that doesn't allow it to continue growing so that they can prosper together. And this is a photo I found on the internet of a cherry blossom tree of two different types of cherries in one. So that's a beautiful concept that shows that as we grow too, we are so reliant on each other to grow together that the grafting is an example in nature. And this is a part of a letter to the Romans that Paul wrote. And he says, this they, he's referring to the Jewish people who were worshiping in the newly formed church in Rome alongside the Gentiles. And naturally, they were clashing a lot at the time. And he's writing to his friends there, if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in. For God is able to graft them in again. So this concept that we are able to somehow shed our part of ourselves when the time comes in order to merge with another part that is essential for our continued growth. We're not talking about dividing the spirit in half. We're not talking about our individuality being broken. That's not what we're saying. But our potentialities, our ability to collaborate with one another, sometimes has to go through these grafting. Just like the tree has to be cut in order to grow more, the grafting is a resource from heaven that Emmanuel explains. If we are open to it, if we allow it to receive it, we can greatly benefit from it. It's up to us, because the beauty of us as eternal spirits is we have free will all the time, and that's always respected, right? And he elaborates in this passage saying every human being is actually a spiritual plant, an object of great care on the part of the divine sower. Each person, like the plant, has different phases of existence: sowing, germination, fertilization, growth, usefulness, blooming, fructification, harvest. So all of these different stages that we can compare, that as we are growing and developing our different talents, our different potentialities, for each one, we go through this stage. And in each stage, there's an important lesson for us to learn there. And so, in understanding this, we can now jump a little more into the parable of the sower and after reading the parable, we're going to comment about the kingdom of heaven and the Sermon of the Mountain to plug the key terms that Christ talks about. Now, how many of you have read or are familiar with the parable of the sower here? Okay, great. So we can have a conversation as we go through it. And the beauty of this parable is that Christ actually explains the whole parable. So we are going to read it and then read Christ's explanation of it, and then we'll talk about it. So the parable begins like this. A farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell by the wayside, and the birds came and ate it up. By the wayside, that's the actual translation from the original Greek. It shows that it's in the periphery of the way, of the path. So it's referring to the severely materialized individuals whose conscious awareness of their spiritual nature is so limited and fragmented that the birds come immediately and eat it up when the seeds fall. And we're going to understand what the seed is referring to. We continue. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell among thorns, which grew up and choked the plants. Still, other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. Imagine one seed yielding a crop of 100 fruits, right? According to Professor Pastorino, who studied the gospel deeply, that's agriculturally impossible, which reaffirms to us that Christ is not talking about physical farming, but he's merely using the parable to compare, right, as an example. So Jesus explains what he's talking about. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. When anyone hears the message about the kingdom of heaven, which we're going to discuss, and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in their heart. That's the first one that falls by the wayside, the periphery of the path. This is the seed sown along the path. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, we have an expression in Portuguese that we call it fire from... Thank you. I don't know how to say palha in English, but it's the hay. Like a hay fire, right? Very quickly. The seed falling on rocky ground refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Do you remember that this is the seed falling on the rocky ground, right? Where the soil is not very deep. The plant quickly sprouts out because of that. But what happens when trouble or persecution comes because of the word? When the sun comes up, that's what Christ is referring to. When the sun of our spiritual understanding, when we become consciously aware of the path, we will immediately expand our horizons and understand what we are surrounded with. And our conscience will awaken, and as a result of that, we will inevitably attract trouble or persecution because of the word. It's only natural. Light eliminates darkness. Darkness cannot exist if there is light, right? They quickly fall away because there was a very short time. It takes time to build roots. It takes time to really deepen oneself. Remember the comment of Emmanuel, a solid house cannot be built in one day? We're also going to see a letter that Paul writes to the Romans that explains the length of time requires for us to develop these qualities that the parable asks of us in order to reach the level of hope with Jesus Christ. The seed falling along, and then he continues, number 22, which is the third seed now. The seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. So the seed falling on the thorns, the person in this situation, and that's anybody, right? We don't have to could categorize this person is here, this person is there, because we all go through it every day in different stages. Since every day is a time of sowing and every day is a time of reaping, right? Here's the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth. So what is he talking about? Those thorns that are there. The plant actually grows. We actually feel the message. We actually understand it. And we could even say we are moved and enchanted by it. But there are way too many thorns around us. So it comes back to our ideas about ourselves, what I should aspire to. In English, there's an expression, keeping up with the Joneses, meaning I need to keep up my appearances. What is he or she going to think if I do this or that? I need to do this. So all of these associations that feed our personality, which is different from our individuality. We discussed that recently on a Tuesday meeting. A personality is from Greek persona, meaning the masks that we wear. And that's what we feed. If we allow the thorns to choke the seed, then the plant will grow, but it will not give fruit. So the person will have the understanding and the idea, but it won't be ready to give and share. And that's where the parable really becomes important, because only in the fourth soil, when it actually starts to provide fruit, that's when it becomes the spiritual awakening, the spiritual growth, our progress. The seed falling on good soil refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. This is the one who produces a crop yielding 160 or 30 times what was sown. What a fruit we give to other people, and it actually sustains them and nourishes them. It's what actually feeds, right, and quenches the thirst. So when he's talking about that in the spiritual point of view, we're going to understand better why Christ many times used parables and not necessarily very straightforward messages when he wasn't able to, for the sake of the people that were there. And this is an explanation of that. The disciples asked him, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?" And he replied, "Because the knowledge," this is very important for us to meditate on, "because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have, even what they have will be taken from them." And up to this point, many people read that and go, "That's not fair. It seems very unjust," right? This is why I speak to them in parables. Though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. You will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. For this, people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears, and they have closed their eyes. And he concludes with a very comforting verse. Very beautiful. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes, hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and turn. That moment is pivotal. And turn, the conversion, when the person literally has the coming to his senses that the younger son in the parable of the prodigal son has. When he rises up, he comes to his senses and he starts walking back. This turning is what would heal them. And their hearts becoming calloused. There are other translations that refer to that word as fattened. So if there's a huge layer of fat around the heart, it becomes impenetrable for light to go in and out. And callous could be another image for it. Now, this is out of our own free will to allow our hearts to become calloused. And they get calloused by what? By things of this world. By our associations and identifications and attachments to things of this world. So, otherwise, I would heal them. So, it goes back to our free will. Up to us. You're going to get a little bit of fresh air in here because the heater is showing its power. It's very, very hot. So Emmanuel elaborates what we understand by that statement. Whoever has more will be given and they'll have an abundance, and whoever doesn't have even what they have will be taken away. Those who give reap the happiness of seeing the multiplication of what they have given. Offer kindness, and you will encourage the sowing of fraternity. And then he has other examples. Offer this, and you will get that. The resources of creation are distributed by the Creator to his creatures so that they may give continuously and multiply infinitely. You will be helped by heaven according to how you are helping on the earth. And then he concludes, we have what we give. So what we truly, truly have in the spiritual sense is only that which we give away. Only that which we relinquish, we surrender. Now we start to have a better understanding of the word death in the spiritual sense. When St. Francis of Assisi says, it is in dying that we are born to eternal life, it doesn't mean it is when my physical body dies and I arrive in the spirit plan that I'm going to be there in eternal life, because we know in our cycles of reincarnation, we have to keep coming. And even when we do reach these stages of the kingdom of heaven inside of us, we will still come with very important reincarnations as missionaries. Right? So the dying means the denying of himself completely so that he can let in his heart a space open up for Christ to start acting through him. It's that conversion, it's that turning that Paul talks about when it is no longer I who live, but the Christ who lives in me. Or the references that he makes in approaching our lives, not like the old man, but as the new man. And in my research, I came across a quote from a person that I don't remember, but is a spiritualist. And I really liked it because we have this tendency to associate religion to a negative connotation. And people love to say, oh no, I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. And sometimes you get, okay, what are you talking about? And it's interesting that person says that. Religion is for people who are afraid to go to hell. Spirituality is for those who have been there. So the gaining of an understanding of pain, of struggle, of the length of time required through many experiences allows us to sink in that we truly, in the end of the day, don't need, and I'm quoting Emmanuel, don't need more spiritism or more spiritualism. We need more spirituality. Because that is what transforms the soil inside of us into good earth that will be fertile. So we only have what we give. And in elaborating a little more this notion of giving away, Christ reinforces this notion with other parables to make sure that his disciples understood. The kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and hid again. And from joy over it, he goes and sells all that he has and buys the field. Right? To the point of relinquishing, of detaching everything that he has in order to go and get that field. When the person realizes that they have found the kingdom of heaven, that sense. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking fine pearls. And upon finding one pearl of great value, he went and sold all that he had and bought the pearl. Right? These were examples that the people he was speaking to at the time could grasp, could understand the notion. But it goes back to this idea of giving away, surrendering. So, finally, we rely on Kardec to explain to us this notion of the kingdom of heaven and Christ saying, my kingdom is not of this world, right? So, I made sure to make of bold, because for the longest time when I would read this, I would think, so what is it Christ is saying? My kingdom is not of this world, so it's somewhere else. So will it ever be here on the planet Earth? Have we ever thought like that, right? He's talking about another location. And it took a long time to dawn on me that he's referring to not of this world, meaning his kingdom is not associated with the values of the material world that we place. But it is here nonetheless. And they explain in the question 1018 and 1019. Question: in what sense should we understand the words of Christ, "My kingdom is not of this world"? Response from the spirits, clear. Christ was responding figuratively. He wanted to say that he only reigned over pure and unselfish hearts. Those pure and unselfish hearts, wherever they might be, they are in Christ's kingdom of heaven. He is in every place where love and goodness rule. However, humans, greedy for the things of this world, are attached to the things of earth and not to him. So, Christ's kingdom is very much in this world, and it's not far away when the earth has become a place of pure spirits and has gone through its evolution from... No, it's not now. It is right here, right now. And then question 1019. Will the kingdom of God ever be realized on earth? The good will reign on earth when, among the spirits who come to inhabit it, the good outnumber the evil ones. They will then enable love and justice, the source of goodness and of happiness, to reign on earth. It is through moral progress and the practice of the laws of God that humans will attract good spirits to the earth and repel the evil ones. However, the evil ones will only leave after humans have banished pride and selfishness from the planet. And here ends the answer to the last question of the Spirit's book. We've seen in other parts of the Spirit's book the answer that the Spirits give to us when we ask, what is our greatest, when Kardec asked, what is our greatest obstacle to progress? What is their response? Selfishness and pride. The question 1019 continues with other very long and beautiful explanations by Plato, by St. Louis, by Paul the Apostle. But the short answer here ends with pride and selfishness. And it's important for us to understand the concept of pride in relation to the parable of the sower, because the opposite of pride is, starts with an H, humility. And humility has everything to do with a good soil. And in the Gospel according to Spiritism, I really need to buy one of those clicker things so I don't go back and forth and the camera has to keep going like this. We start to understand what the good soil has to have in order to provide these fruits of 160 and 30. And Christ describes those conditions in the Sermon of the Mountain, in the so-called Beatitudes, which interestingly is something that Gandhi said if all the books in the world were burned and we had only the Sermon of the Mountain left, we could start civilization all over again. Gandhi said that. So we see in chapter 17, in the chapter where it's entitled Be Perfect, and it is a chapter in the Gospel according to Spiritism that is dedicated to the parable of the sower, the following. Mysteries hidden from the learned and the wise, I render you glory, my Father, Lord of heaven and earth, for having hidden these things from the learned and the wise, and for having revealed them to the simple and small. This is Christ in the moment of prayer and gratitude, acknowledging the tremendous wisdom of the Father. Whoever exalts himself shall be humbled, right? The learned and the wise don't have the access to the secrets of the knowledge of the kingdom of heaven, the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven, because of their pride. Pride blinds us, right? So it is, in the message called Virtue in this chapter, the Spirit François Nicolas Madeleine says, better to have less virtue with modesty than more with pride. For it is through pride that successive humanities have been lost. and it is through humility that they will someday be redeemed. Let's take a moment to examine what she's saying here. Successive humanities. She's not talking about a successive generation or a successive civilization. She's talking about collectives of entire humanities. So when we look back and we imagine entire planets, there's suddenly a moment of resonance and empathy that perhaps right now, and time is relative, but right now, in other places in the universe, in other humanities, in other planets, there might be an entire family of brothers and sisters just like us, struggling and getting blocked from their progress because of the same thing, pride. And I love that she says successive humanities. It encompasses such a huge group. All these individuals were unaware that they were virtuous. She's talking about the humility part. They allowed themselves, and this is so beautiful, they allowed themselves to be carried along by the stream of their saintly inspirations and practiced the good with complete disinterestedness and self-forgetfulness. Allowing oneself to be carried along by the stream of our saintly inspirations. Isn't that giving up, giving away our ego completely and letting us to become an instrument in the hands of God? Really, truly being co-creators with God in a higher expression so that we can achieve this virtue that they talk about. But remember, unaware that they were virtuous. And so the very first beatitude of the Sermon of the Mountain is, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The other beatitude that also mentions kingdom of heaven is, "Blessed are those that are persecuted because of the word, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So you can only be persecuted if you really light a light that is going to truly threaten darkness. And if you are being persecuted in that situation, consider yourself blessed in the Sermon of the Mountain's example of Christ. So there's the condition, though, that in order to be actively working in our spiritual growth and helping others in the process, that we're going to be facing persecution. But it requires, as an essential condition, that we are poor in spirit, humble, right? Any questions so far? How are we doing? Okay. Let's continue. We're almost done. So this is one of my favorite messages that I was able to come across in the incredible universe that is Emmanuel's messages in the gospel. This message I would print in its entirety, but I thought that we were going to run out of time, but I guess I talked too fast. Well, we're going to read and discuss its various elements here. The title of the lesson itself can throw you off. Individualism, right? And that's when Emmanuel here is painting a picture of what the disciple, what the follower of the word goes through in moments where mystics for many, many centuries have called the phenomena of the dark night of the soul. Gurdjieff and so many others mention this dark night of the soul is not a moment of loss and confusion, but it is a moment of expurging, of purgatory that the soul goes through in a very healing and productive way. So while in contact with the ideals of the new revelation, the individual senses his vision naturally expanding and begins to perceive with greater amplitudes the problems that surround him. His sensibility sharpens and his ability to love intensifies. His heart is converted into a deep spiritual estuary. An estuary is where two waters from different rivers, bodies of water meet. And it's a meeting that is very turbulent, right? Wherein all human anguish finds resonance. As a result, his distress is greater. Since his aspirations, the sun comes up, remember? The spiritual aspirations. Those aspirations, they don't startle any attunement in the lower planes that he still breathes. It becomes harder to share those aspirations with other people, right? No one lives alone. But there comes a time when it is indispensable for the soul to know how to struggle in solitude in order to live well. In order to appreciate the barn and enrich the table, the seed, here we go again with the example of the seed, rests amongst millions of others that identify with each other, right? In the barn, in those big sacks, before it goes out into the field. However, when called to produce together with life for the comfort of all, it needs to learn to stay isolated in the cold bosom of the earth, soil, ridding itself of its inferior wrappings, as if reduced to mud and death, as if reduced to mud and death, in order to then shoot off new branches and raise itself to the sun. So that little mustard seed that becomes that majestic, beautiful tree that we saw in that slide went through that stage, or what the mystics call the dark night of the soul, in the soil. But Emmanuel was very clear in this passage that it is not that we isolate ourselves for the end result. This is just a stage, because as we shoot off new branches and raise ourselves to the sun, we start to share our gifts. And he gives examples of, if it weren't for the struggles of Thomas Edison, for endless, endless years, we wouldn't have light. If it wasn't for Gutenberg's struggles, we wouldn't have the printing press, and Marconi and the steam engine. And he gives all of these examples of these people that achieved incredible feats, but they had to go deep into the ground and suffer alone in order to then come up with those discoveries, with those feats, right? Their potentialities were actually yielding a crop of fruit to many people. Each flower gives off a specific fragrance. Each star possesses its own brightness. Each one of us carries a certain mission. And Spiritism, affirming the gospel, comes to assist man and invites them to perfect themselves and grow according to the wisdom of the law that asserts to every man according to his deeds, right? Very beautiful passage. I can share the whole thing if you guys like. Just let me know and I email it to you. This book has not yet been translated, but I was so touched when my friend Ajuso sent this to me that I translated it and I studied it a lot and I shared it with some friends. So there is a moment where we start to not be able to resonate with sometimes our closest dear friends, loved ones, because as we start to allow in our hearts more and more space for our spiritual growth, and we start nearing this stage of being, which is the kingdom of heaven, naturally we may find ourselves distancing ourselves from sometimes our most loved ones that may not understand us, or the people that we used to be friends with. We start noticing that no longer there's a lot of attunement there. And we start to not shy away and disconnect, because after all, in the gospel, in the message about virtue, there is a message called the individual and the world, which is the message number 10 in the chapter 17, where the Spirit is very clear. Don't shy away from the world. Be in this world, but don't need to be of this world. We sense the difference, right? Fully live in this world. And the Spirit says, observe the social conventions, the social frivolities even. Be a part. Go with a spirit of rejoicing and happiness to everything. But go with a purified heart, which will sanctify everything. So, we are called to do this at some point or another in our lives. And the sowing and the reaping happens every day. And the kingdom of heaven then is ours right now if we are able to reach deep into it and start working on our soil, right, for those seeds to germinate. One last comparison is that the kingdom of heaven was explained by a gentleman in Brazil. He's a very renowned scholar. His name is Cesar Reis. He's a professor, and he gave a lecture about the kingdom of heaven. And I actually saw this in Jussara's lecture. She made a reference to him, and I loved the comparison, so I'm repeating it here. He makes us understand the kingdom of heaven with the following comparison. We understand by reading Spiritism that the intelligent principle goes through various stages of evolution and growth, right? Mineral kingdom, and then it grows and develops and reaches the vegetable kingdom, and eventually it reaches the animal kingdom. And when it finally arrives into the human kingdom, it starts to individualize itself into one aware self-conscience, like we are. And then in that moment is given, endowed with free will. And from that point on, it continues. So we understand from reading Spiritism that in the animal kingdom, some of the animals already have fragmented intelligence. They have spurts and have moments of intelligence. And science has been able to actually prove that. You see it in dogs and in cows and some of the mammals. They have fragmented intelligence. We, in the human kingdom, have fragmented moments of this love, this universal love, that is the kingdom of heaven, the state of the kingdom of heaven. We have fragmented spurts. So we go into it and we come out of it. And our struggle through experience and through the length of time required for us to develop the deep roots for the fertile soil is what eventually will get us to remain in that stage of kingdom of heaven, wherever we may be physically. Do you have any questions? Go ahead.
So you said at the end of the day, or I guess you said Emmanuel said, at the end of the day, we don't need more spiritism, more spiritualism, but we need more spirituality.
Yes.
Could you expand on that?
Well, I think what he's trying to say is that we should approach spirituality with a new, clean concept, approach, without labels, without preconceived ideas, without any of the dogmatisms that we've been accustomed to do and putting everything in boxes and labels. So when we spiritualize ourselves, we just are, as it says in another part here, allow ourselves to be carried by saintly inspirations. So it being more connected with our inner God, with our divine essence, without necessarily being affiliated or called this, it, or that.
So I'm thinking like more in our heart, in our head.
Exactly. More in our heart. In fact, the parable of the sower and all of the parables are Christ are not meant to be studied. They're meant to be felt. They're meant to be experienced in our hearts. That's really where the seeds are really finding the fertile soil. So, and we, just to remember something that I heard quoted and I really like, is that every day when we wake up, when the sun rises every day, we have the free will to go out of our house as incarnate spirits in a material world, surrounded by matter. And we have a choice to spiritualize matter, or we have a choice to animalize our spirit based on our choices and based on what we do here, right? And our interactions with one another. Because we do need to have that interaction with each other. And I want to conclude with a quote by Paul. And by the way, the letters of Paul are a study in and of themselves. They are incredibly rich and profound. And if any of you have read the book Paul and Stephen, have you read the book? Have you heard about this book, Paul and Stephen? Highly recommend it, because you will gain such an amazing insight into what a true turning that we talked about earlier, the turning and healing, is seen in Paul. Amazing. And the letters of Paul are actually psychographed, channeled letters that he as a medium was capturing the thoughts of Jesus Christ through the intermediation of Stephen, the martyr of Christianity, the first martyr of Christianity in the spirit realm, to be able to condense those thoughts and feelings into the peri-spiritual brain of Paul so that he could write the letters. And when Peter, Simon, first received them in Jerusalem, he looked at them and he was mesmerized. He said, these are living letters of Christ. We need to take them in that spirit. And very interesting, Paul never wrote these letters by himself. He always surrounded himself with friends, so that if at any moment he was lacking any resources in his heart with feelings that would jeopardize his attunement, he knew that he could count on his friends to provide that spiritual energy, that support, for the letters to be channeled in a precise manner. And the letter to the Romans is the longest letter that he wrote, and it is considered by religious scholars to be his magnum opus, his masterpiece. And this letter describes the feeling of somebody walking around in that state of the kingdom of heaven inside of their hearts. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. So, faith that justifies our actions. When we are acting courageously, we are acting from our heart. After all, courage comes from cuore, which means heart. When we act courageously, we're acting from our hearts. And we are justified by faith because the faithful person acts with courage. Doesn't mean that the person that has faith doesn't feel fear. They do feel fear, but they stand fear face to face in the face and they drive through it. And that's being justified by faith. We have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom also we have obtained our introduction by faith into this grace. We don't often talk about grace in Spiritism. It's a concept that needs to be expanded further. This grace in which we stand, this is a feeling, this is a state of being. Emmanuel, I'm going to say something that Emmanuel mentioned to Chico, that for us to understand, well, how does it feel like? What is the feeling when you are a very elevated spirit? What are they experience, right? And Emmanuel explains to Chico, well, in a very vague way, we could describe that when we approach the climax in an orgasm, in a sexual act, that experience of the orgasm, that feeling, is what the elevated spirits are experiencing permanently. Now imagine that feeling with peace, with serenity, and with our vision expanded, right? That starts to paint a notion of the state of bliss that they feel. This grace in which we stand. That's beautiful. He says stand, meaning awake, alert. And we exult in hope of the glory of God. And not only this, but we also exult in our tribulations. We also exult in our tribulations. It doesn't mean we welcome them. It doesn't mean we want to have them. It means that when they come, we exult. That's a concept that can be very hard for us to actually put into practice, right? We exult in our tribulations, knowing that tribulations brings about perseverance. In some of the translations in Portuguese, the word is not perseverance, it's patience. But perseverance and patience kind of go hand in hand, because in order for you to persevere for a lot in something, you need to have the patience to rise and fall, right? And perseverance yields proven character. And actually what we opened today was very fitting. Bad conversations jeopardize good character, right? Jeopardize, is that what it said? Bad conversations corrupts. Bad conversation corrupts good character. This is the character that Paul's talking about. Perseverance yields to proven character. So the tribulations, right? And proven character, hope. ultimately. And hope does not disappoint, because the love of God has been poured out within our hearts through the Holy Spirit who was given to us. So at the end of all of this, through our tribulations, we are left with that hope, which is that certainty, right, of better days to come, no matter what tribulations we're going through. But this process of perseverance, proven character means experience. You can't achieve, after perseverance and proven character, something that you snap a couple of fingers and do it. It's like the second seed that falls on the ground that is shallow and rocky. It doesn't have a lot of soil, and because it doesn't have roots, they immediately receive it with joy, but when the sun comes up, it gets scorched and withers. It takes time for the seed to mature and get to proven character, which is experience. And so we are left with that hope, right? That certainty. So all of this, like I said, is meant to be felt, is not meant to be intellectualized. And so it's a challenge to reflect together on a parable as rich as this. And the idea is that we can truly feel it. And we've had a chance to go through some of the concepts of the kingdom of heaven, of death, what it is to rise again, the understanding of pain, and the actual sowing and blossoming of our spiritual gifts, to the point where the mustard seed becomes that 10-foot tree. Our individual potentialities as spirits can yield for us to become a Christ one day of a whole planet, right? To think about that notion for a second. It's our destiny. It's up to us to reach that at some point, sooner or later. But it is ultimately where we are headed. Our individuality is headed towards that.